Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
And today, we are engaging with a figure who I think is, well, she's simultaneously one of the most visible and yet probably one of the most illegible figures in American history.
Yeah, illegible is actually a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Because when I first picked up the source material for this deep dive, the Angela Y. Davis reader, I have to admit I had a very specific image in my head.
Right, the icon.
Exactly the icon, the massive afro, the raised fist, the whole 1970s aesthetic. You see her on T-shirts and murals everywhere. She is basically the visual shorthand for revolution for a lot of people.
She is, and she's one of those rare figures who became a global symbol before she even turned 30. But here is the central tension, and really the reason we are doing this deep dive today. The symbol often obscures the actual work.
The image on the T-shirt replaces the intellectual in the library.
Precisely. And frankly, the intellectual in the library is far more dangerous to the status quo than the image on the shirt ever could be.
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are putting the T-shirt aside. We were not talking about her trial or the FBI most wanted list today. We are digging into her work strictly as a structural theorist.
Because if you go into this text expecting a manifesto on how to hold a protest sign, you are going to be very surprised.
I know I was. I was expecting a lot of rhetoric about rights or protest, but that's not really what this is at all.
No, not at all. Davis is doing something more like, well, she's doing systems engineering in reverse. She is taking apart the machinery of society, specifically the legal and penal systems, to show us how they actually function.
She isn't asking if a specific prison is fair or if the guards are well trained.
Right. She's asking, why does this prison exist in the first place, and what economic function is it serving for the broader society?
It feels like she's looking at the wiring under the floorboards of democracy.
That's a fantastic way to phrase it. And the premise she establishes right out of the gate is really fascinating. It's about identity.
Which usually we think of as deeply personal.
Exactly. We usually think of race or gender as these personal attributes. I am this, you are that. It's just who we are. But in Davis's analysis, identity feels heavily functionalized.
Functionalize how?
In her view, identity is a function of political and economic systems. It's something the system uses to organize labor and power. So race isn't just biology or culture. It's a management tool.
A way of sorting populations for specific economic roles.
Exactly. Which brings us to the core conflict of this deep dive. The big monster in the room, the prison industrial complex, or the PIC.
And reading through her analysis of this, she flips the script entirely. Because intuitively, most of us think that prisons are a solution to crime.
Right. Bad things happened. We need a place to put the people who do bad things, so we build a prison. It's a reaction.
That is the standard narrative you get everywhere. It's the basic Law and Order TV show premise. But Davis argues that prisons, as we know them, are not primarily a solution to crime.
She argues they are a structural successor to slavery and a management tool for global capitalism.
Okay, we need to pause on that for a second. Because the phrase successor to slavery is incredibly heavy. And usually when people say something like that, they mean it metaphorically.
Like saying a low-paying job is slavery.
Right, or student debt is slavery. But Davis isn't using metaphors here, is she?
No, she is being entirely literal. She is tracing a direct legal and economic line from the plantation to the penitentiary. She argues that the prison system effectively nationalized the business of slavery after the Civil War.
And to really understand how that works, we have to look at how this system was built, which means looking at the design, the actual architecture of control.
And in the reader, Davis uses this really striking image to kick off this historical analysis. She talks about the Janus head.
The Roman god.
Yes,
Nice.
the Roman god of doorways and transitions. He's depicted with two faces, one looking forward into the future and one looking backward into the past.
It's a slightly unsettling image to think about, having eyes in the back of your head.
It is, but it's the perfect analytical tool for her argument. Davis uses this to describe the American penal system. Her argument is that you cannot understand the future of imprisonment in the United States, the forward face, without staring directly into the face of slavery.
Because they share the same head.
They share the same brain. You cannot treat them as separate, disconnected eras.
So let's look at the foundation of that design. If we are talking about the legal architecture of the system, we have to talk about the Constitution, specifically the 13th Amendment.
The bedrock of American freedom, supposedly.
Right. This is taught as the Good Amendment. Think back to high school history class. We learned that the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Full stop. Lincoln signed it, the war ended, freedom reigned, and everyone moved on.
But that is a surface-level reading. The text itself is the critical starting point. Do you remember how it actually reads?
I can actually recite the first part. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. It seems completely unambiguous.
Keep reading, though. The second half of that sentence is everything.
Except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted.
There it is, the exception clause.
The loophole.
It is a massive design flaw, or rather, a design feature, depending on whose perspective you take. Davis points out that this clause didn't just abolish slavery, it redefined it. It restricted it.
It basically said you can no longer hold slaves privately unless the state convicts them of a crime.
Exactly. It legally permitted the transfer of unfree labor from the private plantation to the state penal system. Slavery wasn't abolished so much as it was nationalized for the criminal class.
So let's play this out historically because Davis walks us through this transition step by step. Practically speaking, the moment the Civil War ends, you have this massive population of formerly enslaved people who are suddenly legally free.
And at the exact same time, the Southern economy is in absolute ruins. It relied entirely on free forced labor.
Right, they didn't just lose a war. They lost their primary capital investment. They lost their machinery, which, horrific as it is to say, happened to be human beings.
They desperately needed a way to get that labor back. But they couldn't just grab people off the street anymore because of the first part of the 13th Amendment. They had to navigate that exception clause.
They had to use the criminal justice system.
Which brings us to the Black Codes.
And these were the local and state laws passed right after the Civil War. I feel like these usually get glossed over in textbooks as just discriminatory laws, but the specifics are wild when you look at them through Davis's structural lens.
They are an absolute masterclass in how you use the law to artificially manufacture a criminal class. These codes criminalized everyday Black life. Vagrancy became a crime. Breach of job contract became a crime. Absence from work was a crime.
Even insulting gestures could be a crime.
Yes. The net was cast incredibly wide.
Let's get really specific about how this worked for a person back then. If you were a freed Black man and you simply didn't have a job, you were a criminal.
Yes. Vagrancy statutes were aggressively enforced. If you couldn't prove you had employment to the local sheriff, you were arrested.
And if you did have a job but you quit, maybe because the boss was abusive, maybe it was your former master, that was also a crime.
Yes, that was a breach of contract.
So you're completely trapped. You can't not work, but you also can't quit the work you have.
That is the brilliant and terrible design of it. The systemic function was entirely economic. The goal was to convert freed slaves back into forced laborers through the mechanism of criminal law.
Because once you are a criminal, the 13th Amendment says you can be enslaved again.
You break a labor contract, you go to court, you get convicted. You are now the property of the state.
And this leads directly into what Davis analyzes as the convict lease system.
Yeah.
And honestly, reading this section of the Reader, this is one of the darkest chapters in the source material. It reads like horror fiction, but it's just dry administrative history.
It is absolute horror.
Right.
But it was standard legal administrative policy. The convict lease system was a structural reconfiguration of the old plantation dynamics. The state essentially acted as a labor broker.
They would arrest people, mostly Black men and women, under these new Black codes.
And then they would lease those prisoners out to private corporations. We are talking coal mines, railroads, timber companies, brickyards.
So the state gets paid a fee by the company, the corporation gets a massive source of incredibly cheap labor, and the person who is arrested gets thrown into a nightmare.
A nightmare that was very often a death sentence. And there is a specific detail in the Reader that really drives this home because it strips away our modern assumption that this was just tough men doing hard time. Davis points to the case of Lizzie Boatwright.
I remember this detail. She was a teenager, wasn't she?
She was 19 years old, a young Black woman in a Georgia convict camp. Now think about the cultural context of the Victorian era, late in the 19th century.
Right. White women were being put on pedestals, treated as delicate, fragile creatures who needed constant protection. The angel in the house archetype.
Exactly. But Lizzie Boatwright, she was forced to work alongside grown men, cutting ditches in the freezing mud. She was brutally whipped and abused.
So Davis uses her story to show how the penal system completely stripped away gender protections based on race.
In the eyes of this economic system, she wasn't a woman in the Victorian sense. She was just a unit of labor. The system didn't care about gender when it came to extraction.
And here is where the analysis gets really interesting from an economic standpoint. Davis makes a comparison between chattel slavery and convict leasing that suggests leasing was actually worse structurally.
Which is a very hard concept to grasp initially.
Right.
We think of chattel slavery as the ultimate absolute evil.
Right. It's hard to imagine a system structurally worse than owning another human being.
But Davis breaks down the mechanics of exploitation. Under chattel slavery, the slave was what she calls aggregated capital. The slave owner had paid a massive amount of money up front for this human being.
It was a capital investment, like buying a piece of heavy machinery or a house. You don't buy a brand new tractor and then smash it with a sledgehammer the next day just for fun.
Exactly. You need that asset to last for years to make your money back. So the owner had a vested economic interest in keeping the enslaved person alive, somewhat healthy enough to work, and able to reproduce.
It was cold and calculated and totally inhumane, but it had a preservation instinct built into the economics. The master wanted the asset to survive.
But under the convict lease system, that preservation instinct is entirely gone. The corporation leasing the prisoner had made no capital investment in the human being at all. They hadn't bought them.
They were just renting them from the state.
Like a rental car versus a car you own. You drive a rental car a lot harder because you don't have to pay for the long-term wear and tear.
And worse, if a prisoner died from overwork or starvation or abuse in the mines, the corporation lost absolutely nothing financially. They didn't lose an investment.
They simply called up the state and leased another prisoner. Davis notes that this led to a vastly higher rate of exploitation. The brutality was completely unchecked because the economic incentive to preserve human life was removed.
One dies, get another. That was the literal administrative logic.
It makes human life disposable in the most literal economic sense. The supply of prisoners was artificial created by the Black Codes, but the corporations treated it as infinite.
It's a machine designed to chew up human beings faster than slavery ever did. And it did all of this under the legitimate guise of law enforcement.
So that is the design layer. That is the historical foundation of the system.
But obviously we aren't in the 1800s anymore. We aren't leasing convicts to build railroads in the same way. But Davis argues the machine didn't stop. It just evolved. Which brings us to the second layer of her analysis, the incentives, the modern economy of punishment.
Because if you want to understand a system, you always have to follow the money. In the 19th century, the state was the direct dealer in crime, profiting from the leases. But Davis traces how this evolves into the modern punishment industry.
And there is a crucial historical pivot point she identifies here that I think a lot of people might miss or just not connect at all: the end of the Cold War.
This is a brilliant connection she makes. We usually think of the Cold War and the domestic prison system as totally separate universes. One is global geopolitics and nuclear weapons. The other is local cops and robbers.
Right, they don't seem related at all.
But structurally, they are deeply linked by capital. Think about the U.S. economy from the 1950s through the 1980s. You had the military-industrial complex, massive government spending, huge contracts for defense firms, constant technology development.
All geared toward fighting an external enemy, communism. It was a massive engine driving the economy. Companies like Lockheed and Westinghouse making billions.
But then the Cold War ends. The Berlin Wall falls. The Soviet Union collapses. Suddenly, that massive industrial apparatus needs a new mission. You have all this manufacturing capacity, all this surveillance technology, all this lobbying power, but no enemy to fight.
You have a solution looking for a problem.
Exactly. And Davis points to a very telling historical event to illustrate this shift. A conference held in 1994 called Law Enforcement Technology in the 21st Century.
The title alone sounds incredibly dystopian.
The guest list was even more so. You had the Secretary of Defense there, you had major defense contractors like Westinghouse presenting, and the entire topic of the conference was retooling.
Retooling meaning what exactly?
Meaning, how do we take technology that was designed for military war advanced surveillance, control systems, weaponry, and apply it to America's domestic streets?
So the external enemy of communism is officially replaced by an internal enemy, crime. And the entire machinery of war gets turned inward.
Precisely. And this creates a brand new economic symbiosis. The defense industry smoothly transitions into the security and punishment industry.
And simultaneously, Davis discusses how the labor aspect evolves. She talks about the joint venture program, specifically looking at California prisons. We start seeing prisons not just as cages to hold people, but as literal factories.
Cheap labor returns to the forefront. History rhyming with the convict lease days. Prisoners doing data entry, taking flight reservations for major airlines, manufacturing circuit boards.
And this is where Davis identifies a perverse incentive loop that is really disturbing because she ties it directly into modern globalization.
This is where the system feels like an inescapable trap for certain communities. Think about the economic flow of the 80s and 90s. Corporations flee the United States to the Third World to find cheaper labor. The era of mass outsourcing.
Which leaves American communities, especially Black and brown communities in urban centers, completely devastated. The factories close, the tax base evaporates, the jobs are gone.
Unemployment skyrockets. And when unemployment rises, the social fabric frays. Desperation sets in, and naturally crime goes up. The state responds to this crisis not with economic aid, but by building massive prisons to manage the newly unemployed surplus population.
And this is the darkest part of the loop, the corporations come back.
They return, but they don't return to the community to open a new factory and pay union wages. They return directly to the prison that the state built in that community.
They use those exact same unemployed people, who are now classified as prisoners, as their new domestic labor force.
But now inside the prison, they don't have to pay minimum wage. They don't have to provide health benefits. They don't have to worry about strikes or labor unions.
There is a quote in the source material from an actual prisoner that sums this entire dynamic up perfectly. It genuinely gave me chills to read. He says, "I am the new American worker."
That quote is absolutely chilling in its clarity. He goes on to say to the outside workers, "You need not worry about NAFTA. I will have at least 5% of your jobs by the end of this decade."
It completely reveals that the prison system isn't isolated from the normal economy. It is an integral part of the labor market. It operates as a shadow labor market.
So we have the design with the legal loophole, and we have the incentives driven by profit and captive labor. Now let's trace the outcomes of this architecture. What does this machine actually produce in society?
Because Davis has a very provocative take on this. Most people think prisons reduce crime.
Davis argues that the system doesn't just respond to crime, it actually produces criminality. It requires criminals to function and sustain itself.
That's a massive claim to make. The idea that the state needs criminals.
But think about it from a purely systems-level perspective. If you build a massive hotel, you need guests to pay the mortgage. If you build a sprawling prison industrial complex with private contracts, maintenance budgets, and occupancy quotas, you need prisoners to justify the budgets.
And this is where we get into the racialization of crime, how the concept of blackness and the concept of criminality became ideologically fused in the American public imagination.
Exactly. If you historically create laws that specifically target the everyday behaviors of one group, like the Black Codes did, then your arrest statistics will inevitably show that group committing more crime.
And over time, the public stops seeing the bias law as the variable. They start seeing the race as the variable.
We stop asking if the system is fair and start asking why those people are so criminal. It's a self-fulfilling statistical prophecy.
There is a really specific example in the sources that illustrates how selective this perception of crime actually is in practice. The stinky rapist case in Berkeley.
Yes, this is a powerful and very uncomfortable example of how the state machinery mobilizes. There was a serial rapist terrorizing Berkeley, and for a long time he was exclusively attacking Black women.
And the police response to this crisis?
Minimal, indifferent. The community was absolutely terrified, but the state machinery barely moved to protect them.
The system didn't see victims, it just saw problems in a problem area.
But then the attacker changed his pattern. He attacked a white woman. And suddenly the entire machine turned on overnight.
Massive resources were immediately mobilized.
Helicopters, extra patrols, massive overtime budgets. But they didn't just look for specific suspects with precision. The police began essentially harassing the entire Black community. They stopped almost any Black man who fit even a vague description.
So the crime only became a public crisis requiring state intervention when the identity of the victim changed.
Exactly. It demonstrates that public safety is very often a coded term for protecting specific social hierarchies, not protecting all citizens equally. When Black women were the victims, it was treated as a localized community issue. When a white woman was attacked, it became a state emergency.
And this naturally brings us to the gendered outcomes of this structural system. We touched on Lizzie Boatwright earlier, but Davis goes much deeper into what she calls the Black matriarch myth.
This connects directly to the famous Moynihan report from the 1960s.
Right. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a major government report.
Yes. The report essentially argued that Black poverty and urban struggles were caused by dysfunctional family structures. Specifically, it claimed that Black families were matriarchal run by women, and that this independence was a social pathology.
It effectively blamed the mothers for the systemic struggles of the entire community.
But Davis flips this narrative completely in her analysis. She goes right back to the structural roots in slavery. She argues that slavery entirely destroyed the traditional feminine sphere for black women.
Because they couldn't be housewives in the traditional Victorian sense. They were legally property.
Right. They were laborers first, women second. She uses this incredible phrase to describe it: deformed equality.
Deformed equality, meaning they were perfectly equal to black men only in their oppression.
Yes. They worked the exact same exhausting fields. They received the exact same brutal punishments. There was no gentler version of slavery for women.
But instead of the modern state looking at that history and seeing the incredible resilience, seeing the strength in how black women managed to hold their families and communities together despite this crushing system, the state pathologized that strength.
It turned the reality of the strong black woman into the racist trope of the welfare queen.
So the state structurally punishes reproductive and familial independence.
It criminalizes the single mother. And the ultimate outcome of all of this, the prisons, the targeted criminalization, the biased enforcement, is what Davis identifies as civil death.
Meaning the total loss of rights.
At the time she was writing these essays, over 4 million people in the U.S. were denied the right to vote because of felony convictions. That is a massive slice of the population, disproportionately black and brown citizens, completely removed from the political process.
It's almost like if you know you can't win their vote, you use the legal system to take away their ballot entirely.
That is certainly one way to interpret the structural outcome of felony disenfranchisement. You neatly remove the political power of the surplus population. If you lock them up, they can't organize in their communities, they can't vote, they can't change the very laws that targeted them.
It becomes a completely self-sealing vessel.
It does.
So if this system is so brutal, and if the incentives driving it are so clearly perverse, why does it keep growing? Why do we as a society keep feeding it? This leads us to the fourth part of our structural arc: persistence. How does the system reinforce itself?
Persistence at this scale relies on massive feedback loops. And the strongest, most effective loop the system has is the ideology of fear.
We talked earlier about the shift from the Cold War to the domestic war on crime. Fear is the fuel that makes that transition possible.
Davis argues that the fear of crime neatly replaced the fear of communism as the primary tool for maintaining social cohesion. It is how the state constantly justifies expanding its power and its budgets.
Because if you are scared, you will vote for almost anything that promises safety. More police, more prisons, tougher sentencing laws.
You won't ask tough questions about the city budget deficit if you believe that spending is the only thing keeping you safe from chaos. It's essentially a blank check for the punishment industry.
And this fear drives what Davis calls the mathematical fallacy. Things like 3 strikes laws.
The logic of 3 strikes treats human beings as simple mathematical variables in an equation. It's based heavily on incapacitation theory. The idea is very simple on the surface. If we lock them up, they physically cannot commit crimes against us.
Therefore, endless prison construction is mathematically and logically justified. It sounds reasonable if you don't look deeper. X equals criminal, move X to prison, society equals safe.
But Davis points out a massive paradox operating under the surface here, a paradox she actually borrows from the philosopher Michel Foucault.
I love Foucault, but he can be notoriously dense. How does she apply his work to the American prison system?
Foucault's paradox is brilliant and incredibly frustrating once you see it. He argues that the prison is always offered as the remedy for the failure of the prison.
Wait, walk me through the logic of that. How does that loop work in practice?
Okay, think about the political rhetoric we hear all the time. If crime statistics go up, what do politicians immediately say?
They say we need to build more prisons, the current ones aren't working, or we don't have enough capacity to hold all the bad guys.
Right, and if crime statistics go down, what do they say then?
They say, look, it's working. Prisons work. We need to keep funding them and building more to keep the crime rate down.
Exactly. The institution acts as its own perpetual justification. It creates a completely self-reinforcing loop where the political answer is always more.
It never asks if the medicine is actually making the patient sicker.
It never pauses to ask if the prison system itself is producing the social conditions, the poverty, the trauma, the broken families that lead to crime in the first place.
And this explains what she calls the blind spot of reform, because we hear about prison reform constantly: better guard training, mandatory body cameras, more humane cell conditions.
This is absolutely crucial to understanding Davis's core philosophy. She is not a reformer. She spends a lot of time explaining why reform usually fails, Reform assumes the system is fundamentally broken and just needs to be fixed.
It assumes the ultimate goal of the system is justice, and it's just making some operational mistakes along the way.
But Davis argues the system isn't broken at all.
She argues it is working exactly as designed.
Its historical design is to control surplus populations and enforce racial and economic hierarchies.
Yeah.
You cannot fix a machine that is successfully doing what it was built to do. You can't reform a slave plantation into a freedom factory by giving the overseers better training. You have to dismantle it entirely.
There is a really poignant historical example of this blind spot in the text involving Frederick Douglass. And this honestly shocked me when I read it.
Yes, Frederick Douglass, the great American abolitionist. The man who escaped slavery and used his brilliant voice to thunder against it his entire life. Davis points out that even he was largely silent on the issue of convict leasing for a long time.
But why? He fought the mechanics of slavery his whole life. How could a mind like his miss it happening right under his nose in the South?
Because he believed deeply in the concept of the law. He believed that if slavery was legally, constitutionally abolished, then the law was now a tool for freedom.
So he couldn't perceive that the law itself, through the black codes and the leasing contracts, was the very thing being used to re-enslave people.
It was a literal crisis in perception. He saw the form of legal freedom, but he missed the function of continued subjugation. And Davis uses this to warn us. If someone as brilliant as Frederick Douglass can miss the structural shift because he trusted the legal framing, we can easily miss it today.
That is a perfect transition to the final section of our analysis, interconnection. Because if the oppression is deeply structural, the resistance to it has to be structural as well. You can't just fight a system this massive with good intentions or simple protests.
Precisely. You cannot fight a structural system with just individual acts of goodness. You need to build a counter-system. And Davis finds the historical roots of this counter-system in the lived history of Black women and culture.
Let's talk about her analysis of the domestic sphere. Because usually when we think of housework, we think of drudgery, unpaid labor. It's the stuff you do before you go do the real work out in the world.
And in Victorian white society, it was definitely framed as a sphere of subordination for women. But Davis argues that for the enslaved Black woman, the domestic sphere was actually a highly radical space.
How does she frame that? Why was it radical?
Because it was the only space that was somewhat removed from the master's direct surveillance and control. The master completely controlled the fields. He controlled the whip. He controlled the production of cash crops.
But in the cabin at night, cooking a meal for her family, cleaning for her own community, that was labor strictly for them.
It was a profound act of care and survival. It was the act of reproducing human life in a system that was explicitly designed to produce social and literal death. Davis calls the Black woman, in this context, the custodian of the house of resistance.
That completely flips the traditional narrative. It's not just doing chores, it's actively maintaining humanity in a system designed to strip it away. It becomes a quiet act of war against dehumanization.
And that quiet resistance eventually spills out into broader culture, into music. Davis does a really deep dive into the historical function of spirituals and the blues, and she treats these songs not just as folk entertainment, but as complex political texts.
She treats them as being as sophisticated as any written political manifesto.
Exactly. Spirituals weren't just religious songs about the afterlife.
They were political maps, right?
Yes. A song like Steal Away wasn't just about going to heaven when you die. It was often a literal signal for a rebellion or an escape attempt, like Nat Turner's Rebellion. It was coded communication happening right under the oppressor's nose.
The master just heard them singing about Jesus, but the enslaved community heard the message that freedom was moving tonight. It was a brilliant tool of counter-perception. And what about the blues? She analyzes figures like Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith. This feels like a very different energy than the spirituals.
It is a different era and a different energy. The spirituals were fundamentally collective. The blues represented the emergence of a new kind of consciousness, a secular, highly individual consciousness post-emancipation.
She analyzes specific songs, too, like Poor Man's Blues.
Poor Man's Blues is a straight-up, unfiltered class critique. It's talking directly about how the wealthy elite grind down the poor working class. It's radical economics set to a 12-bar musical progression.
And then there's the song I Used to Be Your Sweet Mama.
That song is fascinating through Davis's lens. It's ostensibly about a woman rejecting a controlling man. The lyric says, "I used to be your sweet mama, but now I'm just as sour as a lime."
But Davis argues this isn't just a simple breakup song.
No, she argues it structurally mirrors the rejection of state control. It's about a marginalized person violently reclaiming their bodily and emotional autonomy.
Music becomes a way to, as she says, socialize emotions.
To take private, isolated pain and turn it into collective political strength. It tells the listener in the juke joint, you are not crazy. You are not alone in feeling this pressure. The system is doing this to all of us.
So what does all this historical and cultural analysis lead to? If we understand the design, the perverse incentives, the persistence of the system, what is the actual alternative? Because Davis identifies as an abolitionist.
Which is a word that scares a lot of people.
Right. For most people, the word abolition sounds like pure chaos. It sounds like opening all the prison doors tomorrow and letting violent people walk free into the streets.
That is the common fear-based reaction. But Davis talks about something very specific, abolition democracy. This is the key structural takeaway for the future. Abolition isn't just a negative action.
It's not just tearing down the concrete walls and walking away.
No, that is negative abolition. And that alone isn't enough.
So what is positive abolition?
Positive abolition is the hard work of building the social institutions that make prisons unnecessary in the first place. It means taking the billions of dollars in resources we currently pour into cages and armed guards and reconnecting those resources back into massive investments in public education, universal housing, and mental health care.
It's a complete reimagining of the social contract. Instead of investing heavily in social death and civil death at the end of the line, we invest in life at the beginning.
It is. It's about building a working democracy where the state's primary solution to a social problem isn't to remove the person from society, but to actually solve the root problem. And this brings us right back to the central theme we started with today.
So let's bring it all together for the listener. What is the crisis in perception here?
The crisis is that we are stubbornly looking only at the surface. We perceive crime strictly as an individual moral failure, just a bad person making a bad choice. And because of that, we perceive prisons as an unfortunate but absolute necessity, a storage bin for dangerous individuals.
And just like we perceive Angela Davis as just a cool retro image on a poster.
Exactly. We reduce her to nostalgia and aesthetic. We reduce the system to cops and robbers.
But what is the analytical answer? What does her work reveal?
The analytical answer is that we are totally failing to see the obscured structural layers. We are failing to see the massive economic engine of global capital. We are failing to see the historical engine of slavery and convict leasing.
Engines that literally require a permanent, marginalized criminal class to function.
We need that criminalized class to manage surplus unemployment and to suppress political dissent.
So the surface interpretation, the idea of just tweaking the rules, fails because why?
Because reformist logic only tries to fix the excesses of the system. It says, let's make the prison cleaner, or let's have more diverse guards. It completely ignores the fact that the very existence of the system is the actual problem.
And when you finally view it structurally.
When viewed structurally through Davis's framework, the prison is not a solution to crime at all. It is a massive, incredibly well-funded mechanism for the reproduction of race and class hierarchies. The true crisis in perception is our collective inability to imagine a society that does not rely on cages to solve its social problems. We are mentally trapped in the perception that the cage is inevitable. Davis challenges us to perceive a world where it is entirely obsolete.
That is a lot to sit with. It really changes how you look at everything. A news headline about crime, a local policy proposal, or even just a police car driving down your street. It strips away all the comforting lies we tell ourselves about how justice works.
That is the disruptive power of structural theory. It gives you X-ray vision for society. It's not comfortable to look at, but it's the truth.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.